Hello, my name is Kemp, and today I'll be talking about my Explain Everything, Chapter 7, The Origin of Species project. It was created by myself, Kemp, and Julie Mai. First off, I want to discuss how nature is discontinuous. For example, when we see a feline cat in the wild, we can automatically classify it as a lion or a tiger or a cheetah. We just don't have one big group of felines that all look the same. For example, you guys automatically know that that is a lion and that is a tiger right off the bat. Even little kids would be able to answer those questions. These discrete clusters of organisms are considered species. And the question is, how does this happen? We have three very similar organisms, however, but are all separate. For example, the tiger has orange and black stripes. The lion is brown, and the ounce is yellow with black spots. How does this happen? If, as we're taught, evolution is considered a continuous process. So that means that we all came from one single ancestor. We should all have similar traits. Why do we have so much biodiversity? So the question of my lecture that I'll be addressing today is how nature produces similar but different groups of species, which is the problem of speciation. The first question is, what is a species? The morphological species concept is a group of individuals that resemble each other more than they resemble members of other groups. However, that definition causes problems. For example, there are many different skin tones and complexions of humans. For example, black, white, Asian. They all have different but similar skin colors. So why are we not considered different species from each other? For example, African Americans and Caucasians, we're still considered human, but with the morphological species concept, it could be argued that we are in fact different species. Again, we see this with humans with eye colors. We could, the morphological species concept, I'm going to abbreviate that as MSC, would classify each colored eye as a different species. However, that is not the case. Humans are indeed one species. Then we also have the case where we have many types of organisms that look alike, such as female fruit flies, who all look the same, and males only differ in regards to genitalia, but they are considered different species. Again, with mosquitoes, there's 7 different types, but they're only different in regards to who they feed on. Some attack humans and some do not. And that's what makes them different species, which is pretty confusing. We have people who look alike, people who differ, and we don't say that they're different species. And then we have people that look exactly the same, and we say that they are indeed different species. So how do we differentiate? How do we know which is which or which is the right way to go? And a man named Ernest Mayr came up with a solution for that problem. The gold medal standard definition of a species, which is a group of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from such groups, also known as the biological species concept. This is saying for a group of species to be a group of organisms to be considered a species have to be interbreeding. If you're not breeding, together or don't share the same gene pool, then you're not considered a different species. For example, humans, all those the different complexions, we do have interracial relationships, and humans can make viable offsprings, and a Caucasian can make a viable offspring with the African American, and that is why they are considered the same species. And with those fruit flies, those species, those organisms cannot interbreed. The males have different genitalia, so they cannot breed with all 7 different groups of fruit flies. That is why we have different species. So the best way to look at a species is to use this gold standard created by Ernest Mayr, which states that interbreeding is the key. Ernest Mayr's gold medal standard explains why many organisms look alike, however, and are considered different species. Well, you might be wondering, what causes similar organisms to become reproductively isolated? How do we have organisms that came from that organisms that led to 2 different species? How did they become so reproductively isolated where it generated 2 new species? And that's a very important question. There are many different types of reproductive barriers. We have geographic isolation, ecological isolation, and temporal isolation. Geographical isolation is where geography problems such as mountain ranges, droughts, severe weather can lead to two populations of organisms to become isolated from each other. Then we have ecological isolation, where species occur in the same area but they occupy different habitats and rarely encounter each other. And lastly, we have temporal isolation. Species reproduce in different seasons or different times of the day. And we see this with birds, however. Some birds look exactly the same, or same, come from 2 families, but however have different songs. This song does not match that song. There's no connection. So how could they mate? That causes a reproductive barrier. Also, when 2 different species or similar species try to come back to mate, sometimes they make hybrids, and most hybrids are not viable, or they're sterile, or most die before birth. This is how species keep from becoming homogenized or going back together, because they have diverged so much that their genes and genetic code has changed, where they are not capable of mating with each other. All of these barriers can get in the way of love between species. These mechanisms can lead for there to be no viable exchange of genes between organisms, and it leads to speciation. For example, and you may be wondering why, we don't have zebras that look like horses. That's because, and these reproductive barriers causes zebras to only mate with zebras. So that is why zebras look like zebras and don't look like horses. I hope I'm not confusing you by any chance, but I'm saying that because they can't mate with anyone else, that is why there's no more divergence within the horse. Reproductive barriers help explain the origin of species, but how do they arrive is the question of the day. The origin of species. Again, I'll restate that reproductive barriers leads to the origin of species, but how do these barriers evolve? These barriers evolve through long periods of geographic isolation, which can cause species to diverge into two separate species. If you don't believe me, there are three predictions that you can test to see if speciation is in fact caused by geographic isolation. The first prediction is there must have been many opportunities during the history of life for a population to experience isolation. There are many different types of geographic isolations. The common ones are a mountain range rise, glaciers spread, and deserts form, and also we have droughts. Populations don't have to be isolated by geographic barriers. Sometimes they can experience accidental long distance dispersal, which also evolves in isolation from its mainland and ancestor. When the mountain range rises and the glacier spread, we have a barrier that separates our species. It can separate two populations. It can separate a population of our species in half. And if the geographic barrier lasts long enough, let's say millions of years, then it can then lead to two entirely new species. This concept can be tested in a laboratory. Several biologists perform selection experiments, forcing plants and animals to adapt through evolution to different environments. After that adaptation, different populations are tested in the lab to see if they evolve reproductive barriers. Occasionally, the scientists were able to see new beginnings of reproductive isolation. Genetic barriers are quite and often produced. Adaptations to different environments resulted in mating discriminations between the population. Evolution of genetic barriers in a short time confirms geographic speciation. And then it's to the second prediction. If a population must be physically separated to become a species, then we should find similar types of species in close proximity to separated areas. This can be seen with several different types of organisms. A lot of sister species are divided by geographic barriers. For example, we have the snapping shrimp in shallow waters right here. These are all sister species, and they were able to diverge because of the Isthmus of Panama rose, and it separated these 7 shrimp, and now they became different species. The isthmus rose about 3 million years ago, and it allowed for these different types of shrimps to develop reproductive barriers and become reproductively isolated, which led to new species diverging. This can also be seen in sister species of flowering plants in Eastern Northern America and Eastern Asia, such as skunk cabbage, tulip trees, and magnolias. Botanists theorize that each of the 9 pairs used to be a single species distributed across both continents when the world was one large mass. The final prediction that you can test says we should find that reproductive isolation between a pair of physically isolated populations increases slowly with times. This has been seen and tested with fruit flies in the laboratory. Fruit flies were mated many times over and separated. Each pair diverged from its own common ancestor, and then the scientists measured 3 types of reproductive barriers in the laboratory. mating discrimination between the pairs, sterility of their hybrid, their offspring was not viable, and it predicted that reproductive isolation between species increased with time, which is true. In conclusion, we have determined that isolated populations diverge, and when divergence goes on for a long enough time, reproductive barriers develop as a product of evolution. The most common way for speciation to take place is caused by geographic speciation. So, in summary, we have isolated populations. We have a very huge population, and let's say a mountain range rises and separates our population in two. And on one side of the population, evolution selects for orange and black stripes. And then on the other side of the population, natural selection selects for black and white stripes, and they continue on. This process continues on for millions of years, or a million years, and then that amount of time, we should develop two new, distinct, separate, but similar species. And if you still do not believe that geographic isolation leads to reproductive barriers, which is the origin of speciation, evidence for you in the fossil record, which shows splitting lineages from one common ancestor. Also, for evidence for speciation, we have closely related species near geographic barriers. For example, the snapping shrimp by the Isthmus of Panama are very, very similar. However, they are different species and they're separated by a geographic barrier. And then we also have come to the conclusion that new species arrive from reproductive barriers, which we stated earlier. So thank you for tuning in to my lecture capture, and I hope you guys enjoyed yourself on this lesson about the origin of speciation and the cause of speciation. You guys have a good day and bye-bye.